But first, then, Europe is buzzing with a real frenzy of diplomatic activity this week, with meetings in Brussels, Paris, and London. Now, the sheer number of gatherings is a testament to what Europe increasingly sees as existential matters at stake. Well, in the short term, that's first the war in Ukraine, and then in the more long term, how the EU can reduce its defense dependence on the United States, if not become a military superpower in its own right. For more on this, then, we'll cross now to France 24's Europe editor, Armen Georgian, in Brussels. Hi there, Armen. So EU leaders then have already spoken to the Ukrainian president, and they said that no real peace talks are happening for now. Can you tell us more about that?
That's right. So they had an exchange with President Zelensky by video link. He was actually here on the 6th of March in person. So this is the second EU summit in a very short space of time that's really focusing on Ukraine and the broader issue of European defense. They then had this conversation among themselves where they agreed that no real negotiations were happening. And that's, of course, in reference to the phone call between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, which Zelensky briefed EU leaders about. We do actually now have the summit conclusions on Ukraine. They've been made public. Important to note that these conclusions are signed by 26 member states, not 27. Hungary, as expected, did not go along with the Ukraine chapter of the conclusion. So I'll just tell you a few things from that part of the document. They say that they will try to look at the best way to have an influence on the process, on the diplomatic process. So I think that's a tacit admission, once again, that the EU has really been sidelined by the efforts between the US and Russia to talk to each other and not to include the European Union. The 26 say there's strong agreement on continuing political and military support for Ukraine, and also the need to speed up EU accession negotiations for Ukraine to join the European Union, of course, with the caveat that it's got to be a merits-based approach, so Ukraine has to meet the criteria. But just to come back for a second, Aaron, to the military side of things, it's interesting that that the conclusions on Ukraine, they don't mention any figure for urgent military aid to Ukraine, because there has been this thing called the Kaya Kallas plan floating around, named after the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, Kaya Kallas, who had been proposing anything up to 40 billion euros worth of military support for Ukraine. There's a reference to her plan in these summit conclusions, but nothing specific on any figure. And it just says, well, countries can contribute on a voluntary basis. So a bit vague and probably quite a disappointment to Kaya Kallas.
So, Armen, next to the crucial issue of European defense, which is, of course, also one of the big things on the agenda at the summit, have member states made any progress thus far on that?
I'd say there's a bit of a gap between the rhetoric and the reality. So you mentioned existential in your introduction, and that is certainly how some EU leaders are framing the challenges of today. Donald Tusk, for example, who holds the rotating EU presidency, he said that this is the most important defense projects in decades. That's referring to the recent big announcements, the Rearm EU plan and the Defense White Paper, both of which have been recently presented by the European Commission. And then we also heard from the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen a little bit earlier this afternoon, who said the EU will have to find a way to be ready to defend itself within the next 3 to 5 years. So rhetorically, the ambition is pretty high, but there's still a lot of missing chunks of, exactly where this money is going to come from. These proposed 800 billion euros in defense projects. It's not clear whether there is going to be genuine joint borrowing, common borrowing for defense projects or not. We know that there's resistance to to using national debt to finance these projects in certain EU capitals, particularly in Rome and in The Hague in the Netherlands. So a lot of unanswered questions. I think they're going to try to tie some of these threads together, Erin, this evening, because there's a very substantive discussion on the next EU budget called the Multi-Financial Framework, or MFF, where perhaps they might be able to see what a sort of big envelope could look like for the next few years and how defense will fit into that. But of course, this is not an issue that is going to be solved overnight. That's very obvious.